Welcome, everybody, to episode number 18 of The Hopeful Majority. Today's guest will be Victor Shi. And the question is, what does a Gen Z Democrat think about the state of our politics today? It's going to be a fascinating conversation every week. Remember, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content. Last week, we had Vivek Ramaswamy on. We've got some amazing guests coming up. The hopeful majority is growing. Remember, we're trying to fight outrage, build nuance, because this platform is about creating a space for productive dialogue across lines of difference. And most importantly, you know who the key ingredient to that is? You. We need all of us together to be advocating for a world of nuance in the face of the outrage industrial complex. I'm excited for this conversation. I'll see you in the monologue right now. So, the reason why I wanted to have Victor on today is because I was at this event recently and this conservative person came up to me and he said, "Man, those Democrats are insane. How could a young person possibly grow up to be a Democrat?" And I thought, well, who better to answer that question than my friend Victor, who's a prominent influencer online. He's a prominent Democrat. He supports the Biden campaign and the Biden and the Harris ticket in 2024. And I think he has very nuanced views and he really cares about productive dialogue. And here's the kicker. He's 21 years old and he's going to senior year at UCLA. And so I thought, I want to have this conversation. But honestly, the question that motivated this conversation was a question that many people ask me as I work with young people across the country, especially many Republicans ask me, which is why do young people support Democratic Party? What does a Gen Z Democrat think about the state of our politics? Why are they who they are? And I think it's a fascinating prospect to think about because last week we had Vivek Ramaswamy on, who's one of the leading GOP contenders. And you'll notice about the show that we go back and forth and we get a wide variety of perspectives and people from across the political spectrum. Because I think fundamentally the challenge of our moment is not that we all disagree on the how, but we all disagree on the what. And we all agree on the how of having conversations, having dialogues, listening to each other. And so I wanted to bring on Victor. And I think this conversation will really focus on three sort of key components. The first is his upbringing. Why did he become who he is today? He's 21 years old. He could be doing so many different things. Why is he out there on Twitter with 250,000 followers and Instagram 10,000 followers, focusing on building a platform where he's supporting the Democratic Party, exposes himself to a lot of criticism, a lot of flack, as he said towards the end of the conversation that he's often called the Chinese Communist Party spy by people that disagree with him. And whether or not you agree or disagree with his policies, I think it's very important to understand why somebody so young is interested about getting involved in our politics. What motivates them? What drives them? So that's the first piece of this conversation. The second part of this conversation is, well, why the Democratic Party? Last week we had Vivek Ramaswamy on the Republican side, and Vivek talked about why he believes strongly in the Republican Party, ideals of meritocracy, ideals of running not from something but to something. He focuses a lot on the fact that the Democratic Party is focused on censorship and that he feels like a lot of people's liberties are at stake. And when I spend a lot of time in those rooms and those conversations on college campuses and high schools within Republican rooms, I hear a lot of that. And so I'm very curious, well, let's bring on a young Democrat and curious, why does he think what he thinks? There's so many different avenues in our lives, different age levels, different brackets that often will shape how we approach issues, how we approach different policies. And let's get to the nuances of those things, because if we can understand why you're a Democrat, why you're a Republican, why you're an independent, why you don't care about politics, frankly, whatever that question or your category is, it helps us better understand what makes this democracy work. Who are the people that actually live within this democracy? Why vote? Why participate when you don't know why somebody's a Democrat or Republican? If we can actually understand their motivation, I think that's the key to unlocking common ground. That's the key to breaking through. And it's something that I think Victor will talk a lot about in this conversation, which is when you talk at people's values, when you talk to people's convictions, when you understand their story, the fact that we all have parents and siblings and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and friends. And, we also are scared of similar things. And we have basic human emotion. It can go a long way in helping us break past what I call those rigid boundaries. It can go a long way towards disrupting the conflict entrepreneurs, the profiteers, the people that are making money off of our ability to turn against each other. And so I'm always very curious when we bring on somebody that is very strongly partisan to get an understanding for why. I think the answer to the why not only unlocks the key to finding hope and purpose in our lives, but I think it's the key to finding an answer to this fabric that is the complicated American democratic experiment. And the last thing that we're going to focus this conversation on is 2024, is President Biden, is asking some of the critiques that I think a lot of people have of President Biden around his age, around his policy accomplishments, around his agenda. We're going to get into a lot of that because I think those questions get at the core crux of why a lot of people have a lot of discontent with the Democratic Party. We're going to challenge Victor a little bit. And to his credit, and this is the last thing I'll say, to his credit, frankly, he's done a much better job, I think, than this conversation about speaking across lines of difference than I've seen seasoned political pundits do. And this is what I'll leave us with. Gen Z is here ready to have productive conversations, ready to role model good behavior, ready to demonstrate the fact that our democratic polarization is unsustainable. And it is a damn shame that political leaders in their 70s and 60s and 80s and 50s, seasoned veterans, people that have gone across communities and families, can't role model productive disagreement, the ability to disagree better, to listen across differences and empathize, and yet a 21-year-old can. That's where we are in our politics, and we have to fix that. And us young people are ready to model a better vision for our politics, a better understanding of not what, but how. And that's what we do at Bridge USA every day. I meet young people across the country that are standing there saying, yes, we disagree on a lot of things. No, this is not about kumbaya. Yes, I have very strong ideological convictions, and yet there's something more important than those ideological convictions. And that is the state of this democracy, this country. That is your humanity. That is the fact that the way in which we disagree matters a lot. And that's what I ultimately hope to convey through this conversation I had with my friend Isabel Brown, who's a young Gen Z conservative that you can see on episode 5 or 6, I think, or my friend Sophie Barron, who runs a conversation which is on episode 5 or 4. You got young people from across the political spectrum modeling productive disagreement, good behavior, empathy, listening, not just for some kumbaya sake, but because we know that the cornerstone of our democracy requires us to understand that we have to live with people that are all different than ourselves, that have different ideas, different beliefs. Remember, America, 330 million people, all with different backgrounds, different perspectives, different ethnicities, trying to make it work. That's exciting. That's an amazing challenge, and we're here for it. And I hope that people that listen to this hopeful majority that are older than us look to our model, because people like Victor, while you might disagree with a lot of his policies and his partisanship, I think we can all get behind people like him and Isabel and Sophie and all the others that are trying to demonstrate that we have very strong beliefs, but we have a greater conviction. That is to this American experiment, which requires us to listen, think freely, understand each other, empathize across lines of difference. And so, with that, my friends, here's a conversation with Victor Shi. Victor Shi, welcome to the Hopeful Majority, sir.
Manu, it's so great to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
So we were just talking beforehand that you're out in Chicago right now. You're going back to school tomorrow, UCLA. Before we get into anything, I think people should know the fact that you're a super well-spoken young leader, like a lot of young people we know, and you're still on campus. So put all those dots together. How did you get to where you are right now, and what's going on? Why aren't you just spending all your time in the classroom?
Well, first of all, right back at you. I remember the first time we met was, I think, at a Bridge-sponsored event with Equal Citizens, and so it's great to see you all these years later. But I really got my starting in politics back in 8th grade. I often tell the story. I mean, I wasn't influenced by, a lot of people are influenced, I think, by their parents in terms of their political ideology. I was influenced by my teacher. My teacher was just lecturing the political spectrum one day before the 2016 Iowa caucuses, and she just told all of us, what it meant to be a Democrat, what it meant to be a Republican. And then at the end, she said, as young people, you can all make a difference as long as you get involved. And so I sort of internalized that. And ever since sort of, have been on campaigns, have been involved with sort of like the youth, mobilization landscape and also with the media landscape. And so it's been just like knowing that you can be a part of something bigger than yourself has been really meaningful. But on campus, the West Coast is great, as you know, probably as
Right.
someone from Chicago. The weather is great, no winters, the food is great, and I spend some of my time in the classroom, but a lot of it's it's so different from the Midwest, and I really enjoy that aspect of LA and the West Coast, of like just never having to put on like a big coat or having to worry about snow. It's a great part of it.
You're not in the Windy City anymore. I'm so curious.
No.
You're talking about in 8th grade, your teacher said what it means to be a Democrat, what it means to be a Republican. Do you remember by any chance what she said? Because I'm sure that had an impact on sort of how you thought about what you wanted to do and what sort of side of the aisle you wanted to do your work on.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it was a lot of it through the context of, like, who was running. So I remember she was telling us about Trump and what kind of he stood for and how at the time it was very, populist. And she actually compared Bernie Sanders to Trump in many ways that, some of the similarities between, the populist messages and just tapping into sort of that, kind of working class background. And so that was really fascinating to see the kind of those two presented. And then Hillary Clinton, she kind of described more as like an establishment type Democrat. But some of the things that she emphasized just as part of the Republican Party is the focus on the economy. A lot of the things with Trump at the time with trying to ban Mexicans from coming through the border with the wall. And then on the other side, it was more like equality and love and social issues.
Right.
And that I think was really interesting to hear her talk about. But I would say I wasn't really particularly moved by that part, but it was more sort of her telling us, just as young people, just getting
Mm.
involved and making your voices heard and offering sort of a new way of kind of thinking about kind of what do you want to do with your life. Then at the time I was playing video games. And so that was interesting to hear about.
What's fascinating about the story is that you could have picked up, as you said, video games or so many of the other things that people are doing in 8th grade, including myself. And what I find particularly interesting is that your teacher talked about this. The Iowa caucuses are happening, and people often ask me, like, as a young person, and it feels weird me saying young person since you're younger than me, so you're like outflanking me right now. But I'm
You're young
24. How
too.
old are you right now? How old are you?
21.
Okay,
21.
you're 21. Okay, so people say, like, give us an insight into the mindset of somebody that's Gen Z, let's say older Gen Z or mid Gen Z, like you or I. And one of the things that I often talk about is, I was like born around 9/11, right? So I was 2 years old when 9/11 happened. I was
Wow.
in sixth, seventh grade during the financial crash.
Yeah.
Then, I was, just graduating from high school when 2016 happened in the Trump election, and then 2020 when we were graduating college, COVID and the pandemic, the January 6th riots, so not a great sample size of democracy, and you
Right.
were in
Right.
8th grade when President Trump got elected, and so when people often say, like, "Why are people in our generation so skeptical, of democracy or of politics or progress?" That's often what I try to show is a little bit of the mindset. How would you sort of
Totally.
describe
Totally.
like the mindset or the sort of the formative things that have shaped people and that are engaged in our generation?
So you're actually right on, and a lot of what you said is sort of how I describe this generation of people. Which is first, I don't think there's one sort of way to kind of nail down Gen Z, just because there's so many diverse issues that we care about. There's so many different lived experiences. I mean, it's the most diverse generation racially, socioeconomically, just in so many different ways. And so it's hard to kind of view us as a monolith. And I think that's what people
Right.
often mistake. But I think to your point about sort of our outlook on our political system, I mean, we really never knew a time when it felt like kind of we could be unified. I mean, it was just we come on the heels of the anniversary of 9/11. I was just thinking about like the way that people who lived through 9/11 are coming together all these years later and still remembering that moment of coming together as a country. And I think about all of the things that we've experienced as a generation, from COVID to January 6th to all of these sort of really big kind of world changing events, but there isn't that sort of same sense of unity that I feel like probably existed back during 9/11. And so I feel like that's sort of just looking at our
Mm.
political system and always one of kind of dysfunction and disunity and never being able to come together is sort of how I think of kind of this generation, how it's always sort of we feel like it's up to us to really change the way that things are. And I would say also, I mean, like to your point of kind of how we view all these different issues. I mean, there, like I mentioned before, I mean, there isn't one sort of unified way to look at these issues. I think at the end of the day, we just want kind of core values. I mean, things like more
Mm.
representation in government, things like, trying to make progress on these issues that affect all of us, like climate change and, school shootings. But maybe the process is a little bit different, but I think overall,
Mhm.
sort of the values of wanting to live a better and safer life and have more representation is something this generation is really hungry for.
So I definitely want to put a pin, I think, in this
Yeah.
notion that there might be a lot of values and issues that unite our generation. As you said, we might disagree on the process, but we might be in agreement on the what. So I want to get to that. But before
Yeah.
that, I would love for you to introduce yourself officially to people so that we can contextualize why I think you're such a good voice, especially given that we just had Vivek Ramaswamy on from the GOP side last week. Like, take us back to 8th grade, Iowa caucuses, you're getting involved. What happened then, and what about politics kept you coming back? Because there's so many other things you could have probably done.
Oh, for sure, and definitely, I mean, both of my parents have no involvement in politics. My dad is an engineer, my mom's a financial analyst. They're both actually Republicans, and I don't know, maybe it was my young idealistic self. I got involved on a local congressional campaign for Congressman Brad Schneider, and I just started making phone calls, started knocking on doors,
Mm,
and there was something about that feeling. Like it's really hard to describe, but there's no feeling better than talking to someone who might be undecided and giving them information and talking to like asking them what they care about, listening to them, being able to meet them where they are, and then at the end of the conversation, them saying to you, "You changed my mind," or you have my vote now, and it's just like those sort of moments are so special. And like I said before, like knowing that you're a part of something bigger than yourself
mm,
is I think something that's really rare. And I think in politics, like especially being on a campaign where there's so much sort of like trauma bonding in a sense, like you just are all like kind of in the mud trying to win an election. Like that was really awesome as just someone young and someone who's kind of making his way into
mm,
politics. And then just in high school, I mean, I think having people around me, like my teacher in eighth grade, but also my AP government teacher senior year, he told me, as long as you turn 18 by election day, you can run to become a delegate for any presidential candidate. And that sort of nudge
huh,
and that sort of empowerment from my teacher was really, I think, meaningful. But I think along every step along the way, I've been fortunate enough to have people who have sort of provided that nudge for me. And I think civics and politics and this sense of participating in your community was sort of institutionalized in high school and college. UCLA does a great job of making sure that everyone is registered to vote on orientation day, and having people who just instill that sort of civic engagement in you. I think I've been really fortunate enough to have beyond sort of my immediate family, and that sort of kept me going, and knowing that you can be a part of this system and people are there to kind of provide that support for you, and I'm grateful for that.
So this is where I'll save you some pain and tell people that you should go to Victor's Twitter bio right now to get a better understanding of him, because I won't put him on the spot to force him to talk to you about his biography. But he was, according to your Twitter, you're the youngest Biden delegate at that time when you were 18 and you ran for that position. And you can see when you go through Victor's platform, I mean, he's done a lot on this front. And so it's fascinating for me to hear that. I want to take a quick step back, which is funny. You said, the trauma bonding of politics is what really drew me to the process. And I could just hear somebody listening who's like, man, Victor was was really love the pain of politics. But there's something else that you said that I actually think is on a more serious note is fascinating. You said you love the thrill of talking to somebody that's undecided and trying to get them to change their mind or to give them the information. And uh, this is something that I need your help in grappling with, because I feel like the phrase change your mind is something that we've completely abandoned. I think people have completely given up on the people's capacity to be persuaded. What's your take on that?
So I come, and by the way, I admire. I mean, this is like the whole point of your organization is to bring both sides together and somehow find dialogue in there, which I admire so much. So thank you for what you're doing. But in terms of persuasion, I mean, I often think about it in the way organizing. I think is very a lot of the times, at least the traditional model I've been told is you try to reach the most number of voter contacts and you try to knock on the most doors, make the most phone calls. But something that I thought was fascinating that really started to take off in 2020, but especially in 2022, is this term relational organizing, which is more
Mm,
you come at it from the sense of, okay, like I want to understand you as a human being. Like I want to understand what you care about, what motivates you as a person, rather than asking off the bat, who do you support in this election or what are your politics? Like starting off as like what do you care about? What is your life? Just trying to understand you at a human level, I think is really important. And I think something that we lose sight of a lot in this kind of political sphere that we live in. I think so much of it is kind of rushing toward, what your political ideology is. And if it doesn't agree with you, then you immediately dismiss them. And I just don't think that sustainable way to run any sort of campaign or sort of a functioning political society. And I think just understanding people from who they are and from a human perspective really does a lot
mm.
in listening and hearing what they say, and then responding in the appropriate way. But that sort of relational organizing, I think, is something that I hope will sort of be sustained. But that's sort of how I view things, is just not rushing toward politics, just understanding the person as at a human level, and then going from there, not dismissing what they have to say.
I could hear somebody right now, Victor, that's skeptical being like, relational organizing. I've also heard it called deep canvassing, for example, where
Yes,
you're
yes.
going into a community and I don't know, treating people, like actually talking to them and listening to them and hearing their aspirations. I could hear somebody skeptical saying, there is no chance that that has any possibility for success right now, given how polarized the climate is, given how polarized the media climate is. And then as a result, you'll often see a move towards sort of that mobilization strategy, which is forget persuasion, let's mobilize our base. And to me, it seems like that's pushing us to this never-ending arms race. How do you think through that critique of relational organizing?
I understand it. I think there are definitely, that's sort of like the broad overview, but I think in specific conversations, one of the things I try to do, at least back in 2020 when I was organizing, is, sure, when you meet someone with differing political ideology, I think that at least my first instinct, before, being trained on it, would be, well, that's a less voter. But I think really making sure and always kind of telling yourself again that this person, you may not agree on, say, I'm just going to take like abortion. Like that's a very extreme position. And
Mhm.
I think that's something where it's not as easy for me to persuade someone on that issue. But I think if you can
Sure.
find, for example, like democracy or like elections, like, like asking them, if they are, for instance, if they are skeptical at January 6th, asking them like, what are the, venues or mediums of information that have persuaded you to have this sort of outlook? And once you get to kind of realize that they listen to certain, outlets, they have been persuaded by certain evidence, then, sometimes all it takes is, nudging them toward, well, have you considered this? Or, asking them a simple question of, well, have you seen this article? Or might I be able to kind of point you in that direction? And
Mhm.
sometimes it's baby steps. And I think that is often also something that people, I think, kind of when they organize or when they do deep canvassing, that you can't really change someone's mind in just one conversation. That's why organizing is a constant thing. That's why you have to build teams where you're constantly talking to people and you're making the same phone calls and you're, talking to your team. But I think kind of taking it step by step and pointing that person in just that sort of direction, and often thinking about, giving them the light they need to hopefully kind of reach that destination. But I think it's more of a journey than rather than kind of just one immediate kind of conversation.
Yeah. Well, what's frustrating about this moment for me, doing the work we do at Bridge USA, where we're sort of bringing together these dialogues, is I think people immediately assume that when you think about relationship building or talking to somebody across lines of difference, the only three issues that are ever going to define that entire human is like abortion, gun control, and
Right.
maybe something that's deep in the culture war. And yes, those are very important issues, but like we're complex beings with so much around us. And I struggle with this notion that I think so many people in our generation, I think in some ways, at least I've seen this, are oftentimes we're quick to write off the other, whatever the quote unquote other might be, whether you're on the left or the right, or whether you're of a certain race or identity group. We're so likely to write off the other because we assume that they're completely unreachable and defined by these three or four issue sets. Like, not every conversation you talk to has to be with one with like Tucker Carlson. Like, there's a
Right.
lot of people before you get to Tucker. So, how do you think through that? Do you find that as a sentiment in our generation at all?
I For the most part, I haven't had any immediate conversations like that, but I would say in terms of just kind of I do think there's a lot of, like, general apathy among young people and, going to school in LA, one of the things I notice often is people there don't really care about politics in the same way that
Yeah.
someone in DC might. But I also think one of the ways, I think about a lot of the times entry points in terms of how people can just sort of make that first step to caring about something. And I've actually found using celebrities is a really great way of like, oh, like,
Yep.
hey, did you see what Taylor Swift posted recently? She posted a story on her Instagram of registering people to vote, and just getting that people to think about, oh, well, like I listen to Taylor Swift or I listen to XYZ artist. This XYZ artist made some sort of political statement, and I don't ask them, do you agree with it? I don't try to assert my political ideology on them. I just ask them, hey, Leon, did you see, XYZ rapper made this comment about an issue. What do you think of that? And then like going from there, but sort of like going from this place of like, I'm curious what your thoughts are, and then having that conversation rather than, okay, like here are my beliefs. I'm trying to impose them on you, or, I want to know what you think about this
Mm.
issue. Just asking them, did you see this? And that's a very simple way
Yep.
of getting them to kind of care about an issue because they see someone who they really enjoy seeing commenting on that issue, if that makes sense.
It's so funny. It's like the way you're talking about this is just like how you talk to normal people. I feel like we've complexified politics, democracy when like yeah, it's like, okay, how do I talk to somebody I disagree with? I don't know, show them things, talk about things that you might
Yes.
agree on. It's not that complicated, yet I think we're so quick to give up on that process in the political world. I want to take a quick step
I mean,
back.
if I
You
can make
mentioned
a
your parents
quick
are. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just I mean, if I can make a quick point about, I think one of the and we're probably gonna get into this a little bit later, but one of the
Yeah.
recent examples of this is, so I got invited to go on Fox News, and I was very hesitant to go on Fox News just because I had this conception in my mind that it was, very right wing, and I think a lot of Democrats, for instance, Elizabeth Warren has a strict no Fox policy, whereas you
Mhm.
see many people like Pete Buttigieg going on Fox, and I think you have a wide array of kind of views on what Fox is and whether or not you should go on it, but I think a lot of the people on the Democratic side, when they go on Fox, they like to make it, very antagonistic. They like to attack that audience. But one of the things I think people get wrong about Fox is, you're trying to reach the people who hopefully are just kind of walking by the TV screen and just kind of look up at Fox. And, you're trying to reach them. And you don't persuade people by being antagonistic or by attacking them for believing in, the big lie or for believing in what they believe in. You want to try to come from a place of sort of humility and respect. And I'm here not to change your mind, but I'm here just to present some facts and just to present
Mm.
what I believe is a different way of looking at things, and doing it from a place of calmness and not falling into that sort of yelling and back and forth. I just don't think that's a way to persuade people. But there is a lot of people on our side who do view Fox as sort of like, if you go in there, you have to be loud, you have to be assertive, you have to be very just, it's like a shouting ring, but I just don't think that's the case. But there's a lot of that, I think, on our side.
Well, you said a lot of that is on your side, that sort of sentiment. What was your experience like on Fox News? I was actually gonna ask you that because there are a few of your interviews. What was your experience like?
Honestly, for the most part, very civil. I mean, granted, I'm not going on like, Laura Ingraham or Jesse Waters. I don't know what that's like, but at least in my experience, I mean, the team has been very nice. It's been very fair questioning by Dana Perino and Bill Hemmer, which is the only show I've been on. But it's genuinely like, what as a young Democrat, what do you think? And then I'm often paired with a young Republican. What do you think?
Mhm.
And it's never been a shouting match. It's always been sort of just us coming to the table with what we've what our outlook is, and it's never escalated to what I imagined Fox to be, and I think that's been a big surprise.
Do you think there's a particular reason why they keep having you back?
I actually think because Fox genuinely wants to have the other side. I mean, if you look at Fox's most popular show, it's The Five, and there are four Republicans, one Democrat. It's the highest rated show on Fox, and I genuinely think Fox does try to bring their audience a different perspective, at least especially for daytime programming and also for sort of like the before 7 p.m. hour. I do think there's an appetite. If you look at sort of the demographic breakdown of Fox, yes, it's older people, but it's also a lot of independent folks. And there are some left leaning folks who do watch Fox. And I think they
Mm.
aren't as extreme as some people make them out to be.
How do you think MSNBC does?
I think MSNBC is more definitely further left. I don't often see the sort of willingness to have on the other side as much as I do perhaps with like CNN, which I think presents itself
Mm.
more as like a neutral kind of both sides network. Now, granted, there are some people like I think they just signed a deal with John Kasich, who represents that sort of never Trump wing of the party, but you don't really see them platforming someone who comes from like a Turning Point USA background or someone who's like a Ben Shapiro, like that sort of equivalent. And I think MSNBC is a little bit more siloed to the left.
Do you think they should?
I mean, I think it depends, and I often wrestle with this, and because I think it's so hard to, grapple with. For instance, I mean, the other week, Ari Melber had on Bill Maher, and Bill Maher, say what you want about Bill Maher, he has some problematic viewpoints, but I think the only kind of way that you can have someone like that on, or someone who does, from like Donald Trump on, Kristen Welker had on Donald Trump, is if I think you really push back against their lies, and I think that's really important. And I think, to Fox's credit, whenever I'm on Fox, they also find a way to challenge me on my assertions, and that makes sense. But I think you have to be able to kind of push back against that sort of narrative if you have on someone, with really, I don't want to say grotesque views, but someone who believes in what they do.
So that's fascinating because, and I had asked this of Vivek last week, Vivek
Yeah.
Ramaswamy, which was when I'm talking to Vivek in person, when we're having a conversation, we're on the podcast, he sounds really persuasive and also, frankly, just a nice person. There's a lot of conversation happening. We're
Totally.
having
Yeah.
good dialogue. Uh, Very different than what he's like on Twitter. You know, uh, I spend a lot of time with whoever's coming on the Hopeful Majority to really learn about you, like your background. So I study your Twitter, study everybody else's Twitter, and I'm talking to Victor. I'm like, man, you're like not agreeable just for the sake of being agreeable. I'm sure if I said something that you disagree with, you'd stand up for that. I think that's the point of this conversation is let's have healthy disagreement. And yet you're
Absolutely.
approaching this in a pretty understanding way. And yet I have to ask you, because when I sometimes see the Twitter feed, it's very different in terms of tone from who you are right now. And this is not just a you thing. This is something that I see across the board. It's something that I've seen myself doing. Why do you think there's a difference between how we, and I don't want to just say you, I mean, how we as people show up on a platform like Twitter, as opposed to, an in person conversation or a podcast or whatever the case might be? And you could also disagree with the assertion that maybe you are the same person, but
Yeah, I actually really haven't thought much about that. I mean, I would say I am definitely more pointed on Twitter, especially toward like media organizations and what Republicans
Mhm,
say. Um, but I don't know. I do feel like at least for my Twitter, what I try to do through my Twitter is, and I often do these threads because I don't think you can totally encapsulate things from just a one kind of, I don't know what the character limit now on Twitter is, but like 280 character kind of tweet. I do think it's important to provide, your sources and to provide background on what's happening. And I try to do that for the most part. But I would say I'm definitely less afraid, I think, to call out people on Twitter. Maybe it's
mhm,
something about being online. And something about Twitter now that scares me a lot is, with the new kind of checkmark platform, like, or checkmark policy, there's just this sort of like anonymity, I think, behind a screen that I think being in person just doesn't really replicate so much. But I think being online, at least for me, I don't know. I tend to find that Twitter is more like you can throw those punches, but at least for me, I try to provide that context whenever I can, and providing those sources and providing that background information I think is important because a lot of Twitter is very back and forth and very, one side
mhm.
attacks the other and everyone's sort of in their own camps. But I don't know. I've never really thought of my different personalities online versus in person, which is fascinating to hear you say that.
Well, I mean, I'm catching up with you after 3.5 years, and I know you pretty well from an online standpoint. And I think a lot of folks that might be listening to this have seen you online, and I also know you in person. And I think we're all, I think, in some ways guilty of this. And I feel weird even talking about this because I sense myself doing it, and I feel like a part of it is just the incentive structure that exists online, where to win in a Twitter discourse, you have to be argumentative, you have to punch, and
Totally,
who am
yes.
I to say don't punch? Punching is important. Like disagreement is the engine of democracy. You need to have disagreement. But I feel like part of the reason why so many people in our generation are just completely apathetic or have disengaged is because it just looks like a shit show online. Like,
Yeah,
how do you
yeah.
think about those dynamics?
So okay, so I guess I often get trolls and I often get people who, come after, my Twitter handle. And one of the things I don't necessarily buy into is, a lot of people I think who I see on Twitter when they get people who disagree with them, it's immediately like block, or it's immediately, well, like I'm just gonna, it's very, I don't know what the right word for it, maybe
It's like throw the
snarky.
walls up.
Like,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, like, yes, exactly, and you don't really have that dialogue, but I actually, I don't mind having that conversation with someone who I disagree with on Twitter. There have been plenty of people on Twitter who I disagree with, who you have that conversation with, and it's rare to find those moments where you can kind of go back and forth in a tweet exchange. But I would say, I don't know, like, a lot of that, I think, happens for me, at least, through DMs. I mean, you have those
Mhm.
conversations, I don't think, through, like, the spotlight. A lot of people will DM me, or a lot of people might, say something in the comments, and I'll DM them and say, "Hey, I'd love to learn more about what you think about this," or, let's have this conversation, but not in that sort of, public forum. I've never been really a fan of that, but I'm definitely happy.
Mhm.
I think it's much better to have those conversations through a DM platform. But when it comes to trolls and when it comes to people who do go into
Yeah.
comments, it's always a matter of, well, okay, is this person commenting for the sake of, you know, do they want to push the dialogue, and do they want to, I guess, have that
It's
conversation in a
about the
meaningful,
intent.
right?
Yeah.
Yes, the intent. Or is it just like, I'm just attacking you because I view you as, someone on the left and who, is a snowflake Democrat or something. But if that person is generally coming to the conversation and saying, look, your points are well taken, but I disagree because of XYZ, then I'm much more willing to have that conversation. I think that's the type of disagreement that I much rather prefer us having online or through DMs.
Do you think that Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, online sort
Yeah.
of social media in general, has been good or productive for our democracy? And I know that's a loaded question because there's a lot of angles and dimensions there, and there's a lot of back and forth you can have on the values of having online platforms, especially in democratic countries. But how do you approach that? Because it's something that I get asked a lot as a Gen Zer. Like, y'all, people often say y'all are totally digitally native. You must love Twitter or whatever the case, Instagram, whatever. What's your diagnosis of the platforms and their impact on the health of our democracy?
I mean, I think Twitter is great because, at least for me, I don't really have another like platform in which I can get news real time in such a kind of fast way. And I think for that reason,
Mm.
like I think it's really important to know like who I'm following and to make sure that the people who I'm following are trusted sources. But I also don't want to say that this generation is totally immune from the privies of misinformation, disinformation. There is a real problem, I think, with sort of the lack of information literacy and the overall kind of lack of, I think, things that schools do to teach this generation about how to, think online and not to fall prey to, these headlines. But I think for me, Twitter, I would say is a value add as long as not to fall for misinformation, disinformation, to always check for the sources, to always check that, what you're seeing is accurate. And not saying that I've been perfect. I've fallen for many, headlines that have suggested one thing, but in reality, turns out to be another. But I think what Twitter does offer is that ability to stay up with the news in a very kind of real time and kind of live way that I don't think other platforms do. And TikTok is also great. A lot of people get their news from TikTok now, but at the end of the day, it's also knowing how to kind of consume that information and always, being sort of skeptical about the information that you're being presented and being very intentional about who you follow and knowing that those people are people who are committed to facts and do kind of
So
put out information before they, tweet something, I guess.
I'll definitely give you that Twitter is, I think, one of the best ways to get breaking news. I frankly, I mean, like, for example, take the Prigozhin, when his plane
Yeah,
got taken down
yes.
over Russia. Like that, I learned through Twitter, through Brian Krasenstein's account, I think. And I also saw the videos and everything like that. I 100% agree. But I don't know, man. I don't know if I agree with it being a value add. I mean, you look at, I mean, just take your case, for example, and take somebody like Vivek and take Andrew Yang is a little different. We had him on the pod too a little bit ago, but like it's just um we're so much kinder, so much willing to be relational.
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
if I showed my brother who's now starting to become more politically awakened, he's in ninth grade now, and I say like, all right, here are your two models of politics. One is I show an in-person conversation between you and somebody, maybe let's say in the Midwest or in the Iowa caucuses, and you're having a conversation with them. I showed them that model of politics. And secondarily, I take the Twitter threads and show that. I mean, like, who would you who
I
would who would you want your kids to see, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I'll also say I don't think I don't think Twitter is real life at all. I don't think a lot of people, like, the majority of the country is not on Twitter. I think Twitter for me is more useful in terms of kind of narrative shifting and narrative building and sort of like getting that information. Like, you kind of have to be strong on Twitter to get that information for better or for
I
worse,
agree
I
with that.
guess.
I
But
agree with that.
I think most people don't operate in the way that Twitter does, and most people, I think, the biggest mistake I see people, kind of the Twitterverse and a lot of sort of the influencers on Twitter, like, they think what happens on Twitter is also real life, but that's just not the case. And I think that's actually
Mm.
to, for instance, I mean, the Biden campaign's credit in 2020, one of the things that it did, I think, very, very well is that, they were on Twitter, but they were really kind of aware and cognizant of the fact that what the conversation on Twitter is not the conversation that's happening in, say, rural Iowa or in Los Angeles or in other place. It's more of sort of like DC centric, like people who are just really in tune to politics, people who are the strongest personalities. But I actually don't know how big of an impact what happens on Twitter has in on ordinary kind of democracy landscape. I think it definitely has an impact on media and politicians and journalists and people who have sort of that platform, but it doesn't really impact, I think, what people are thinking of it, my neighbor is thinking of in Chicago.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right that Twitter is not real life. I mean, Dave Chappelle's a famous quote that's like,
Yes,
"Whatever
yes,
happens
yes.
at Twitter is not my business." It ain't real life. And I think that the local store owner down the street has literally could give two shits about what happens on
Yeah,
Twitter.
yeah,
And
right.
yet, where it does seem to start impacting real life is because almost every news show seems to be driven by Twitter narratives or Twitter news
Yeah,
cycles.
yeah,
Because the reason why you're working to change narratives on Twitter is because the media is what picks up what
yes,
happens on Twitter. And so I agree with you. It's a separate universe until the media takes that as the mechanism to drive its narrative. And so that's where it starts to actually impact I think, real people.
But I do think that with more kind of diverse young voices on Twitter who have that ability to have a platform, the more they do that, I do think that media organizations are starting to take a okay, not that it's perfect and it's far from where I would like it to be, but I do think a lot of the kind of big sort of young influencers on Twitter are beginning to shift what traditional and legacy media do cover. I mean, part of the reason why I call out media, for instance, is not saying that my voice is necessarily shaping or changing the narrative, but traditional media has often not really had many stories about young people or not really had a
Mm,
lot of segments focused on the youth electorate, but I think that's starting to change a lot. And I think, people like Olivia Juliano, who is also a Twitter kind of big person on Twitter, my colleague Santiago Mayer, a lot of people on Twitter, I think they are starting to get traditional media to change how they cover things, start paying more attention to youth related issues, start, paying
mm,
attention to these things that might affect young people. And I think in that sense, Twitter, if you can break Twitter, I do think that, and if you can reach the people who you need to reach, I think it can be powerful in that sense. And it's a very uphill battle, but I think it can make a difference in terms of the narratives that
yeah.
you are beginning to see on TV.
Yeah, I think it is right in that if you learn how to master the tool to break narratives or to shift them in your direction, I think it certainly has impact. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. I got to take notes from you in terms of how you're doing it, and I think frankly, a lot of people that are trying to advocate for work around bridging or listening or talking to each other, I don't think are as effective on Twitter. So I think you're 100% right on that. What I think a lot about um, is it is it breaking the strength and quality of our discourse, because it seems like if the
Mhm.
goal of Twitter is it's a tool and the tool is it's a hammer, right? It's a hammer to get your narrative through. Problem is everybody's got this damn hammer. So everybody's hammering away. Charlie Kirk is just holds just as strong convictions as you do in terms of how to push his narrative in terms of his
Yeah,
thing. And so suddenly the problem is that the hammers in everybody's hands, everybody's hammering away and everybody's got a narrative to shift. And then suddenly to the outside person it looks like, "Oh my god, our politics is a never-ending arms race." And so that's
yeah,
like what I'm wrestling with. That's what I'm wrestling with is it's a tool, I agree with you, and yet it's making my life so much more difficult because I hear everyday people just gradually by the thousands disengaging because they're like, "I can't touch this." And then as you know, I think one of the ways that we slip into authoritarianism is not through a big bang, but through a slump. We slump our way
yeah,
into it because people just
right.
disengage. And so that's my concern.
Yes, and I definitely share your concern, and I guess I go back to the point where, like, I don't know how much, like my friend at UCLA or, my friend who's in college is really paying attention to the Twitter discourse. But I think as someone who does have that sort of, who does come from, a place of, being informed, I do think it's also up to all of us to have those conversations. And that's why I think Bridge is so important, to have those conversations on the ground with people and to make them aware of, like, just basically not to shy away from those in-person conversations. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people tend to think that what happens online is, the entire political discourse, but I don't think it is. And I think, at least when I have my conversations with my friends, you know, I think if it, you can just think of yourself as sort of that trusted messenger and you have more influence on them than I think that a lot of people realize. But having those in-person conversations and not sort of succumbing to whatever the narrative is on Twitter and being able to just talk to people in person in real life, I think goes a really long way.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it goes to your earlier point of relational organizing. Ultimately, if you want to create the change you want to see, you have to be able to bridge, listen to people across lines of
Yes.
difference. And I think,
Yes.
I mean, you're echoing that 100%. All right. We just talked about Twitter, whether or not it's an impact in real life. We just spent 25 minutes of the conversation on Twitter. So I want to shift a little bit back to you. You mentioned Biden. You mentioned being one of his youngest delegates in 2020.
Yeah.
You're obviously a Democrat, and I think a lot of people would immediately say that when they go to your platform. I was recently, Victor, at an event, and my mind goes crazy these days because I'm at events on across the spectrum, and I was at an event, and
Yes.
this
I see your stories.
conservative comes up to me and says, you know, um, he's like, "Man, these Democrats are crazy. How could a young person possibly be a Democrat today?" I want you to speak to that person. What was your political story? Like why what was your awakening? What is your journey that makes you feel like the Democratic Party for you personally is the right vehicle to build the world that you want to see? Is it for short, why are you a Democrat?
I would say a lot of the reason why I initially started off as a Democrat is because of what I saw with Trump, and so, as someone who it comes from an immigrant background, as someone who is a young person in society where you come from a marginalized group, to hear Trump and his rhetoric toward Mexicans and black people was really to me concerning, and part of the reason why I at first in 2016 supported Democrats was because I didn't really hear that sort of same rhetoric coming from my congressperson or coming from Hillary Clinton. And then of course having to live through those Trump years of slowly degrading rules or these norms that make up our institutions was to me something that it was more of a repulsion from the Republican Party, and seeing the Democrats were sort of the last sort of option. Then in 2020, of course, there were so many great Democratic candidates. But what really appealed me to Joe Biden wasn't necessarily his politics; it was actually his ability to get things to like his appeal, his sense of appealing in a bipartisan way, of coming
Mm,
together as that candidate who could bring together a kind of divided nation, who could bring together a country that was through so much turmoil after the Trump years. I didn't actually think that what he could get done would be kind of what we see now, but I think sort of offering that kind of antidote to Trump, someone who really is compassionate and empathetic, and someone who kind of at the end of the day has gone through so much trauma and who has gone through so much just hardship and who can relate to people on that one-on-one basis. You can question whether or not that is even breaking through, but sort of seeing that kind of alternative to me was a large part of the reason why I think I kind of was attracted to the Democratic Party. Now, specifically on policy, I do think that for me, some of the biggest issues are kind of around democracy, and so I think I started off in politics through by looking at the Electoral College and by looking at ranked choice voting and by looking at kind of all these ways that kind of our system has sort of favored or sort of been kind of changed in a way to I don't want to say benefit Republicans, but you talk about gerrymandering to dilute kind of minority voices to me, and finding ways to change that. There was only one party that was pushing for that sort of electoral change, and it was the Democratic Party.
mm. So I was sitting in Cheesecake Factory last weekend. Shout out to Cheesecake Factory. Of all the places I've been to, I will never give up on the Cheesecake Factory. And I was sitting there with my
So
sister,
good.
right? And we're talking about abortion. And it was a really complicated conversation. We went a lot of different ways. And then the question of
Yeah.
Biden came up. And interestingly enough, we had a conversation about the 2024 election. I asked her, what do you think about Biden? And she immediately brought up the question of age. And I think that that's a concern that a lot of people in our generation have for both candidates, and frankly, a lot of people in our politics. How do you respond to the critique that while
Yeah.
President Biden is an incredibly empathetic person, I think, frankly, I would defend that. I think that is true. Just like I told Vivek last week, that I think some of his stuff is accurate on how he thinks about the world. But that being said, how do you respond to the age question?
I think you have to acknowledge it. No one is forgetting the fact that he's 80 years old. No one is forgetting about the fact that, he does have, occasional stumbles and all of that. But whenever I talk about his age, it's okay, yes, he might be old, but you also have to look at what he's been able to do at 80 years old. I mean, he has a record that I think really speaks for itself. Things that, whether or not you disagree with him on his policy, he's doing things that would benefit all Americans that past presidents have tried to do but couldn't do. So you think of, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, he announced that pharmaceutical companies could, or I guess Medicare could start negotiating prices for different drugs, and that was something that Trump tried to do, but he couldn't. But Biden was able to do it. Think about the Infrastructure Act. Trump tried to make that was a huge part of his administration. He couldn't do it, but President Biden was able to do it. And so I think that sort of record and that sort of experience that he brings really speaks for itself. Now, there's also part of that that just isn't breaking through with young people, and I think that is also really concerning. We can totally have that conversation about how we can try to do that. But in terms of age, that's what I try to emphasize. And then also, what's the alternative? I mean, the person who's leading the Republican nomination right now is only 3 years younger. He's 4 times indicted, been twice
Mm,
impeached. He faces numerous, felony counts. And I think that sort of alternative, is that really the alternative that you want? And I know it's dissatisfying to kind of always be thinking about the lesser of the two evils, but that's sort of the moment that we find ourselves in right now. And there's, to me at least, only one candidate who, no matter how much you might disagree with him on policy, at least he's there to protect our democracy. At least he follows laws and he respects our institutions and actually
mm.
tries to make people's lives better. And that, to me, at the end of the day, matters far more than age. And I understand people who are concerned about his mental capacity and all of that, but you just have to look at what he's been able to do. And I think that speaks volumes.
Yeah, I guess the challenge right now is we live in this very disaggregated media environment where affect, emotions, stories have much more resonance than policy victories, right? And I bet that's something that you, as somebody that supports and probably bangs your head against the wall, because it's like I can list all these different accomplishments that, let's say, you might agree with, and yet they don't break through. And so I guess the curiosity that I hold right now, I could hear a listener thinking through this with me, and they want me to ask this question, which is, all right, let's say he's got some of those policy wins and policy victories. He's 80. There's a real conversation to be had about his vice president. And a lot of people find Kamala Harris deeply unpopular when you look at polling across the board. And the question then becomes, well, what about the VP ticket? How do you think through that question? Because it is a real consideration to really think through, because he would be the oldest president in the history of the United States.
I think part of having someone like Kamala Harris on the ticket is actually to counterbalance some of those concerns about his age, and I do agree with you. A lot of people find Kamala Harris unpopular. But when you look at sort of the crosstabs, the groups that find Kamala Harris the most popular are young people and non-whites and women. And I think those, that's the base of the Democratic Party. And for anyone who doubts sort of that power that Kamala Harris brings, all you have to do is look at kind of where she's shown up. I mean, she's now doing this nationwide college tour. She's really investing time and effort to go to those groups that matter, to go to young people, to listen to them, to have that conversation with them, and people have been generally enthusiastic. And I think a lot of people who doubt Kamala Harris, I think, are mostly sort of, they exist in that sort of punditry and media landscape, but I would actually say that she does bring a sort of
Mm,
vigor and energy to the ticket that Biden couldn't bring alone. And I think and it's taken a long time, I think, for this administration to kind of figure out what Kamala is best at, sort of, and best positioned in terms of tackling. I would say she wasn't really great on immigration. I think that was a very hard sell. But you look at sort of the way that the fiercest way that she's pushed back things like, the abortion bans, things like book banning, going to Florida and pushing back against Ron DeSantis's claim that slavery had some sort of benefit. Those are the moments that she's the strongest,
mm.
the moments that she's pushing back directly, sort of in her sort of prosecutor style. And I think that's sort of what people really like to see in our politics. Someone who
So,
is young, who's diverse, who pushes back. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think I haven't looked at a lot of the crosstabs personally, because a lot of our work is less in the partisan realm and the electoral game
Sure.
and much more in how we mobilize people around discourse and dialogue. But I can say from a
Yeah.
lot of personal anecdotal evidence that the excitement just around the Biden Harris ticket is just a little weak, and I think there
Yeah.
has to be
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
defense around that. But here's my sort of like last sort of piece on this, which is when you think about sort of this electoral race and you talk about the lesser of two evils, I think the American people are also just growing exhausted of this constant lesser of two evils, lesser of two evils. I mean, there's basically two issues that the Democrats are banking on in 24, it seems, which is abortion, which is a dark horse issue that I think is going to probably turn on a lot of people for Democrats, and Trump. And one of the lines that honestly I got to give Vivek credit for, that he said, I want you to interrogate this. He's like, everybody's running from something. I'm running to something. And I think that's a powerful line. And what do you think the Democratic Party right now is running towards? What's the
I mean, I
vision?
think
Like what's the vision that is not just like we are here so that Trump doesn't exist?
I think you're. I mean, I've been very, and all you have to do is look at sort of this sort of administration's records. I think there are plenty of things that this administration is running to, and Democrats are running to on the whole. You think of last week, they established the first ever gun violence prevention office, and some of the things that you see Democrats focused on are, I think, very substantive issues. I mean, gun violence, the number one cause of death among young people. This is an issue that Democrats are fiercely engaged on. And you look at what's happening in states all across the country, and I think that speaks a lot more about kind of where this party is headed. States like Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, where they are pushing for better lives for young people, whether that's gun, whether that's creating more background checks, or whether that's banning assault weapons, or providing free breakfast and lunch to students in high schools and elementary schools. Those are the things I think this Democratic Party is running towards. It's creating that sort of, I know it sounds sort of grand and cliche, but just a society in which young people and people don't have to fear for their rights. A society in which people can go to the ballot box and have an easy time voting. A society in which you can be a student, not have to fear for gun violence. A society in which you can not fear about whether or not climate change is going to totally ravage your community. I think those are the things that Democrats are really focused on, and I
Mm.
think it sometimes gets lost in this sort of national discourse. But I just look at what states like, again, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania have been able to do with their sort of trifecta of a Democratic state House, Senate, and governorship. And those policies, I think, really represent the best of the Democratic Party. But you don't really often see that happening in DC.
So for anybody joining Victor, I always make this disclaimer when we get into deep policy stuff. People are like, Manu, why don't you go into the policy? I'm like, because you could watch so many of other Victor's interviews on policy. I did the same thing with Vivek. What I'm really curious about is you as the person. Why do you care about what you care about? I think most Americans are just curious about those that are leading us or those that are talking about our politics. Like, what motivates you? What drives you? So yes, Victor just talked about a bunch of policy things, and I'm going to leave it at that because you can also go to the
Can I
Vivek
just say,
episode where
Manu?
you can see a lot of the counters. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, what I don't really, I mean, I do a lot of podcasts, but I think the way, like that sort of philosophy is something I don't really see often. I find it so fascinating is because you do get to humanize these people who you see on sort of out there. And
Yeah.
that's so important. And I think that makes politics a little bit, hopefully, a little bit more appealing to people.
Welcome to the hopeful majority, my friend. Where we where
Yes.
we where we where we stay hopeful and
Yeah.
optimistic. What's funny is I appreciate you saying that because and this is actually where I want to go back to you as a person because if you notice, we started the conversation. I wanted people to get to understand what drives you. I want to close the conversation with again the fact that you are a human. And speaking of the fact that you are a human, though, in a couple of years, you never know. AI bots get real prevalent
I
these
know.
days.
Yes.
But let's make the assumption that Victor's a human, right? And I'm listening to this. I'm like, God, this Victor kid, he's so eloquent, he's so smart, he's so interesting, and yet I just can't stand the fact that he supports President Biden in the 2024 elections. Talking to that person, what would you say people that critique you that are Republicans or really strong conservatives misunderstand about either you or the Democratic Party?
I would say about me personally is that I think a lot of people who see me online or who see me on TV just assume that, I'm another Democrat that doesn't really engage in, you know, cross political kind of conversation. But I actually, coming from a household in which both of my parents are Republicans, these are the type of things that I think about a lot, which is I do think it's really important to reach out to the other side and listen to what they have to say. I think that's what people, I think, a lot of the times just assume that just because I'm a Democrat, I'm just sort of in my silo. But I actually try a lot to have those conversations with people around me. And sure, it may not happen on Twitter, but at least just through like talking to Republicans, trying to think what they think, and finding that common ground is something I still deeply believe in, no matter how sort of polarized our society is, whether it's, and it starts with, I think, the people around me. I mean, I have a conversation with my parents a lot of the times about, what do you think about what's happening with Trump? What do you think about, they live in Chicago, and one of the things that they talk about a lot is, the crime that is happening in Chicago and some of the headlines they see. And I think it would be very easy for me, or for, people online might think that, oh, I might hear, what they talk about with crime and just assume that they're misguided and, we won't even engage in that conversation. But I'm actually really, I care a lot about, thinking about what the other side thinks and meeting them where they are as well. And so I would say that's something that people tend to get wrong. But I think that sort of, cross political dialogue is so missing right now, and something that I hope that, one by one we can sort of bring back.
I mean, I can certainly say, brother, you're 21 and you're extraordinarily humble. It's something I would, anybody that's listening to this, and I talk to a lot of political leaders and all types of these folks, and again, I maintain a lower profile, but now again, forcibly, I'm getting out there too because we got to shape narratives. We got to use that Twitter hammer. But I would say like the conversation that you and I just had, where I asked very direct questions like, "Do you think your Twitter persona is the same as your in-person persona? What do you think the Democrats are getting wrong?" You're responding to these questions in really productive ways. And I think it's important for people to know that people like you that they think are promoting certain things, give people a chance to
Yeah.
explain. And I think we aren't giving people the chance to be better. And I don't think we're giving people the second chance to show that they might have something of value to offer. So here's the other piece I would just ask you, which is you mentioned your relationship with your parents. You mentioned that they're Republicans, you're a Democrat. You talk about things like the Chicago violence issues and the fact that you have to, talk to them about some of those challenges. How are your conversations with your parents like? And like, what advice would you give to somebody that probably has a, you know, politically challenging family where they might be on one side of the issue and the other person might be on the other side? How have you navigated those conversations?
I definitely think, for me and my parents, one of the things is, not making it, a constant thing. I think it becomes very exhausting to try to think that you can talk about it every single day and not be exhausted just because they're your parents. For me, how I approach it is, sometimes I'll just mention, like, hey, like, did you see this Trump indictment? Or hey, like, I know this is an issue. Do you want to talk about this? And I think at the end of the day, sort of listening and hearing about what they have to say, and then kind of going back to kind of our previous conversations, I don't think it's different, the fact that it's my parents. I think maybe it's better because I view my sort of kind of role in that a little bit more seriously, in the fact that I am a trusted messenger, I think, for my parents, and I think
Mm,
I have more of an ability to persuade them on sort of different issues and present a side that maybe they never considered. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's still my goal to persuade them to change totally on, you
right.
know, thinking that Chicago violence is out of hand. I mean, like, what they see on TV is valid, and they oftentimes tell me, like, well, you don't live here, and so you don't understand the reality. And I say, sure, I might not live here, but here's also the data, and I'm just presenting this data to you, and it's your choice whether or not you want to take this. But here's what's happening. I mean, Chicago is not the only city where it's happening. You also have deep red pockets that this is also happening in. And so, I understand your concern, but this is also part of the reality.
Mm,
And so, but it's not my position, I think, to change their worldview. I do think it's easier for me to do that because I'm their son, and hopefully they can listen to me more so than the person who's on TV. But I just don't think it's productive for anyone to think that they can go into a conversation and be that sort of white knight and just totally
mm,
change the way that someone thinks about it. It's a very gradual thing. It took a long time for my parents to go from supporting Donald Trump in 2016 to not end up, supporting him right now. It's a slow thing of slowly saying, oh wow, well, like, that comment toward Asian Americans during the pandemic was concerning. No one should be
mm.
calling, the coronavirus, the China virus, or the Kung flu. That's just acceptable. And slowly they begin to see this pattern, but it's something that doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's something that I always remind myself is, even though I'm their son, even though I am that trusted messenger for them, it's a process and it's gradual and it's a journey to get them to where they are now.
And also not every conversation across a line of difference has to have the end goal or success metric be that you change their mind. I mean,
Right.
you also just learn a lot about your own perspective
Yes.
and your own background. I think
Totally.
that's demonstrable of it. What's your advice to parents that might have kids that have different political values than them? How have your parents sort of continued to support you in all the amazing work you're doing? Like, what would your advice be to a parent that's listening to this and they're like, I have a young Victor as well, you know? What's your take on that? What would your advice be to them?
I'll reiterate kind of what I said earlier, which is, I mean, first, like, not rushing toward imposing your political ideology on them. I think it's really important just to let your kid, develop, what they're interested in, and to go down that path. I don't think there's any problem with, for example, my parents often ask me, are you sure you want to go into this politics? Are you sure you believe in these causes? But I think, it's very great for parents to make sure that, what their, child believes in is truly what they believe in, and offering them, counter viewpoints. But if your child really does have different political ideologies, compared to you, I would say, just sort of accepting that, and not demonizing them in any way, not sort of attacking them in any way. Having that constructive dialogue, I think, is very important. And often, asking them, what do you think about this, or have you ever considered this? But
Mm,
never dismissing them for what they're doing, because I think for any young person who is in our world, this. I mean, it's hard to get people to care about politics, and if people care about politics, I think at the end of the day, they do it because they really care about it, and they do it because they
mhm,
hope that their voice can hopefully change things, or them being involved can change things. And I think for parents to impose their sort of viewpoint on them, or for them to attack their child just because they have different political viewpoints, it could end up actually making them, less kind of attached to politics. And we don't want that, I think.
Do you ever, like, wake up at night and be like, "Oh my god, I might be wrong?" Do you ever, like, question your beliefs or your certitude towards certain causes or towards issues or policies?
Um,
Is there ever,
Now,
like, a moment where I'm like, "Oh my god, I might actually be wrong on this?"
I
Or
don't
do you
really
feel
think
like you've
that
got it
much.
down pat?
Nothing wakes me up like in the middle of the night, but I mean, I do often, like,
Right.
I think a lot of my viewpoints do shape based off of what I read, through, like, I try to consume information from both sides of the spectrum. And I think a lot of the times, like, maybe I might think of things differently, but nothing where I'm like, oh shoot, like, I'm, doing the wrong thing, or like I'm fighting on, like, the wrong side of things. That doesn't really happen much. But I would say
Mm,
my issues, like, I do like, slowly, I might think of things in a different way, and that sort of like slowly reshapes and rethinks sort of how I look at the world, but nothing where it's like, oh, like I'm in the wrong kind of side of things.
Yeah, I put myself, Victor, over the last year through this like intellectual gymnastics course basically where I like read, oh my god, I read everything. I read everything from one side, the other side, up, down,
Yep.
middle. And I think one of my weak points, and this is something I would critique people that are doing bridging work, is I think when you're so focused on relationship building, when you're so focused on reaching people that might disagree with you, sometimes I struggle to actually try to understand what do I actually believe? Because I do believe in
Yeah.
empathy. I do believe in understanding. I do believe in reaching somebody. I care more about your story oftentimes than my story. But sometimes what that puts me in a position of is like, I don't actually sometimes know. And it's
Mm.
it's this weird
Yeah.
process I'm wrestling with where I'm trying to balance having intellectual humility and having a desire to reach people across difference and seeing your story and seeing the truth that you believe is true. And at the same time having my own convictions. And it's a journey I'm on, and I don't do you have any advice for that? Like, how do you think one should navigate that? Because I I I don't think I'll ever just my temperament is I don't think I'll ever have policy convictions that are as strong as yours.
Mm.
I might on some things, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I do have very strong convictions about how we should show up in society, how we should behave, how we should be democratic. So what would your advice be to someone like me that, you know, just sometimes doesn't know what to believe, Like, how do you navigate that?
I mean, I don't think it's
And
ever
there's a flip question of it to you, which is like
yeah.
you very strongly believe, but you also wanna maintain a degree of intellectual humility to maybe see you might be wrong on something. Like, how do you walk those balances?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know if I have a very satisfying answer to that, but I like for me at least, I often think about, it's very hard, I think, to separate your convictions from, like putting that aside and truly listening to someone. And I also don't think it's a bad thing to have convictions yourself. I mean, it takes, I think, a
Yep,
while, but like I think being able to separate those two, I think is actually a really important skill that not a lot of people have. I think a lot of people just assume that their convictions are automatically another person's convictions or ideologies, but to be able to truly kind of put yours aside for a minute and to understand kind of the other person's is something that I think is very admirable. I actually could get better at that. I think a lot of the times is, like I have very strong beliefs on certain issues, and as much as I try to, um, listen to people and have those conversations, I do find, sometimes I'm not able to separate it as much as I hope to. But I don't know. I just think I think we can all have opinions. I mean, I think that's just what it means to be human. And a lot of the way that the media presents itself right now is very neutral and quote unquote objective. But I don't think it's wrong to have an opinion on just basic things that make up our democracy, things like having free and fair
yep,
elections, things like facts, things those things I think are okay to
like
have
free
an
speech,
opinion on.
etcetera.
Free speech, right? Those I think are totally fine. And sure, maybe the policy areas are a little bit um grayer and require a little bit more thought, but I think it's okay to have that opinion and to express those opinions, but knowing that at the end of the day, if it's your job to show up in those spaces as, the bridger or the person who does connect, knowing how to separate that from, your convictions, which I think you are able to do quite well, I think is a very good thing.
All right. One last question came to mind while you're talking about how you show up in these spaces. And I'm going to ask you the last question that we ask everybody from politicians to celebrities to amazing people like you to random people, everybody. But before that question, I just want to ask you, let's say I'm a young person, I'm listening to this, I'm hearing your perspective, I'm hearing your takes. And I, one is I'm just curious how, like, what is your advice to me about, the work that you're doing? But secondarily, is how do you have the not necessarily confidence, but sort of this sense of self-assuredness and a sense of sort of security within yourself to not get hurt by all the incoming because politics is tough, man. And I
Yeah.
know how difficult it can get. And I'm sure there's moments where and I mean you're young and you're 21, friend groups can get compromised and relationships can get challenged and your entire life is out there. How do you navigate all that? And what's your advice to somebody young that's um just curious about how you got to where you are today and how you developed that sort of sheet or sort of shield of armor.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the first question first. I would say for anyone listening to this who might be curious about how they can get involved, I would say, there's so much of politics, and as you know, the theme of this podcast has shown, is really messy. I think what happens in DC is oftentimes very, sensationalized, and people talk about politics in these big and grand terms, and there's a lot. It's very polarized. But I would say, at least for me, the moments where I'm most hopeful is taking a step back and looking at what's happening in my community and looking at what's happening on the local and state level, and that's sort of the area where I wish that we had more emphasis on sort of like getting young people to care about politics in that sense. Like,
Mm,
sure, DC might be exciting, and that's where all the action is happening, but there's also just take a look at what's happening in your community and find ways to get involved on that level, because things can happen at much quicker pace. You can make a much bigger difference, and things can actually happen. And that's what I think is the most rewarding part about politics, is that you make your voice heard and you see the change that you want to see happen, and that's much easier to be done, I think, on a state and local level. And we don't often talk about those levels as much as we do what's happening in DC and the federal. So I think just sort of taking a step back, looking at how you can contribute in your local district, that makes, I think, for a much better experience in politics. But for me, and for anyone who's in this political system and who has a lot incoming, I would say first, there's a sense of, I think, just knowing, separating, like what I said before, like separating the people who constructively want to make your work better and the people who just are sort of, you know, exist and who attack you just because they want to attack you. And I often think about, I watched Brene Brown a couple of years ago, and one of my favorite quotes from her is often thinking about the people who are in the arena and the people who aren't in the arena. And there are plenty of cheap seats in this world who will just hurl criticism at you constantly. The people who are on Twitter, who are on social media, who are always there saying, this is so stupid. You're just dumb. You're another Chinese Communist Party spy, versus the people who actually are there to make your work better. And I think always sort of ask yourself which of the two it is. I think is has helped me sort of stay grounded and know, not to get caught up in the noise and not to get caught up in the people who are attacking me, and really focus on the people who are there to make it better, and the people whose opinions I really value. And I think having that list of people, and I think friends are really important, of having a list of people you can go to and ask them, what do you think of what I did here, and tell me honestly. I think that really helps me stay grounded and stay sort of true to myself, and not get caught up in that sort of noisy, polarized world out there that just seeks to, shut people down and hurl criticism and attacks.
Next time somebody calls you a Chinese Communist Party spy, you send them my way. You send them. We'll take care of that. It just speaks to the stupidity of our politics. And though I would
Totally.
say that Victor, to your point though, like you are somebody in the arena. Teddy Roosevelt has a quote on this too, of the man
Yes.
in the arena, and the fact that you're
Yes.
bloodied and
Yep.
yet that's the purpose. Last quick thing, because I know we're short on time, which is I always ask everybody, what is your why? I think having the answer to the why, President Biden actually talks a lot about this, which is, a sense of purpose, a sense of belief in what you're doing gets you through a lot of those hardships. He talks about how it got him through his hardship with losing his family early on. Um, what is your why? Why do you do what you do?
I think because we live in such a complicated and messy world where there's so much polarization, there's so much just attacking each other, and I long to go back to a reality where you can disagree civilly and still be able to go out for drinks, and where we can live in a media environment in which facts really mattered, in which you can disagree on opinions maybe, but at least you agreed on facts. And that's why I'm in sort of, I do a lot of communication work. I do a lot of media stuff, is to hopefully provide that sort of light and facts, and to hopefully go back to that reality where you can talk about politics. It could be fun, but and still be human at the end of the day, and look at each other in sort of a human way, and not immediately dismiss the other person. But I think we live in such a polarized world and country, and to hopefully go back to a place where we can see that sort of unity that defined our country during moments like 9/11, I think is part of the reason why I do the work that I do.
Where can people find your podcast?
So really anywhere. So we're on YouTube, at youtube.com/politicon, but also all over Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever
What
you
is it
stream
called?
your podcast. It's called iGen Politics.
iGen Politics, people. Victor Shi, thank you for gracing the hopeful majority, sir.
Thank you for having me on, Manu. It's so great to see you.
Thank you so much to Victor for joining the Hopeful Majority. I hope you enjoyed that conversation because we went everywhere from Biden to Trump to Victor's upbringing to his relationship with his parents. I really appreciated the way that he showed up in that conversation. And as you know, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple would love your reviews on Spotify, and Apple would love your likes and subscribes on YouTube. We need the feedback. We need all of us to build this Hopeful Majority. I'll see you on next week's episode.